That's a very interesting question. So data privacy and data security are, of course, one of the major concerns when you get started with data analytics, and of course, one of the absolutely fundamental requirements. So when we started out, we said, what's the most secure way we can do data analytics? And we said the most secure place you can imagine for hosting data and processing data are the spaces that companies have already built up. So they already built up data lakes, they already bought licenses for specific BI tools. So we set all of the requirements list that you usually have in terms of GDPR, in terms of encryption, in terms of authorizations, roles management. All of that is already checked. They already made a decision. And the best thing we can do is integrate with these systems that they've already selected, already greenlit. So basically, we thought about how can we build the kinds of tools that allow us to implement in their infrastructure with the tools they have greenlit, and then we make sure we comply with all the requirements. I think when it comes to data quality, there's a large fallacy. Most people come from the traditional world where you have an application, it does a specific thing, it gets something in, it processes it and turns something out. And people say garbage in, garbage out, because most applications do not work reliable. However, when it comes to analysis and to risk management, what now has become a liability becomes a large asset because that's what we want to manage. So basically, the governments say, you're allowed to do business internationally as long as you make sure that you really understand what you are selling, whom you are selling it to, whether the goods that you have might pose a risk from an economic or from a national security perspective, and if the parties you are doing that business with might also be subject to those risks. So as long as you can make sure that you understand that, get the right requirements in place, get the authorizations, point the rules or licenses that you have, you're allowed to do business. So if you fail to have accurate data, you fail to comply with these requirements in the first place. So what we said is pointing towards these issues in data, and there are different kinds of gaps in data, is absolutely key to do effective trade compliance management. And there are multiple ways you can find those issues in the data quality. So the first one is to say, do we have the data where we need it, right? Do you keep records about what you're exporting, what your determinations are? Do you have that information available? The next one is, does it fulfill minimum formatting requirements? So for example, if someone puts in dummy, you might know you have this mask in front of you on a web page, you need to fill out something, you don't know what it is, just put in a placeholder value, off it goes, right? We cannot accept these kinds of values, so we can do first sanity checks. The next one is, are the values you have appropriate from multiple points of view? So maybe you have something that's subject to US origins, to the EIR, do you have an appropriate classification? So there are already many things where we can check, does it principally work? And the last level is also consistency, right? You have many different systems that collect pieces of information. Are they consistent with each other? And all of these are very, let's say, basic checks you can do just based on the data that you have, that don't require special assessment from an expert, that don't require evaluations from the government. All of these are things you can determine just by looking at the data, and that's what we help companies take accountability for. Yeah, so I would say when it comes to integrating diverse sets of data, you got three main challenges. And the first one is just the logistics of it. You have a store system, you need to pull out the data, you need to transfer it to a space, and by reusing existing data lakes, that is already solved to a degree. Most source systems are connected. So the logistical part, right, in 2025 is pretty much accounted for. The next one is organizational, right? You have ownership over data, you have concerns about using data for different use cases, you have a governance board, right? And that's an organizational challenge that you need to say, hey, we want to use the data for our use case. Now, what oftentimes happens is, let's say you have Carl from data governance, you will say, hey, we don't want to share the data with you, right? And in that case, it really helps that in trade compliance, we're dealing with large liabilities, right? That we can go to executive leadership and say, hey, the executive leader, Carl from data governance doesn't want us to use the data. However, Mr. Trump, Mr. Jinping, Ms. von der Leyen, they all expect us to do compliance at the highest level, and they expect us to take accountability. And by the way, you are personally liable if we violate some of these expectations. Now, that's a very fruitful discussion we can have in trade compliance nowadays to solve the governance layer. Now, the last part of that is how do we logically stitch the data together and what data do we need? And for that, we have a network of experts in ERP systems, in trade compliance data to find the right data. And then we've built special tools that help us to stitch the data together and to make meaningful analysis on that. And that's basically where our core value comes in, that we're able to get the data logically and compare it across a lot of different source systems and make very advanced, accurate assessments on a subject matter level. So complex environments come in two forms, right? They come in the form of what tech stack you have to work with. And luckily, most companies already consolidated the data from their source system into central data lakes, business warehouses, data warehouses, however they might call them, right? But they already are very concerned about having an overlook of what are we selling worldwide, what are we purchasing. So all the central business data is in one place. The actual challenge comes in stitching together these differently structured logical sets of data, right? And that's where our core value comes in, where we've really invested into systems that allow us to harmonize data, but also take into account that data is logically structured differently. And part of that is, of course, technology. But I think the other most important part is we need to be able to bring in the subject matter understanding and interpretation of the data to tailor something to different source systems. Because having complex data is not let's say, a specialty in data analysis. But in professional environments, everyone has complicated systems. They have 14 different ERPs for 14 different areas of the world. They might have acquired companies. So that's I think the fundamental hypothesis we have to work from. I'm thinking of two kinds of use cases that I find very interesting because there are, I think, common misconceptions, right? A lot of people have a trade compliance management system that does a thing and they expect that thing to work perfectly, right? So I think what people have to overcome is the assumption that only because you have a policy and you have a system, it works perfect every time. So the first example is a transaction that we caught was business between EU and Iran. It was perfectly legal to do business from EU with Iran, using the appropriate licenses. So that's what they did. So they sent the delivery to the trade compliance management system. It was saying, yes, you're perfectly fine. There you go. Perfect did its, the system did its job. However, what happened afterwards is what the accounting did said, oh, we now want to get an invoice. We want to get paid for this. Why don't we get paid in US dollars? Now, the issue is that US thinks fundamentally different about Iran. You're not allowed to do business with Iranian parties, and you're not allowed to use the US dollars. However, that's information that doesn't make it to the GTS, right? By the time that you need to capture that risk, the transaction already went through. So by design, the system, the trade compliance management system, cannot capture this case. I think for these kinds of scenarios, there are many, many more. You need some kind of additional assurance layer like SEIA to really capture all of these risks. And the second case is related to deliveries. So a lot of people think that, of course, there are blocks in a system like GTS, for example, that should also trigger blocks in the physical movement of the goods. However, what happens a lot of times is that these are two separate systems. They are they live in different worlds. And you can have something blocked in one system, but still someone in your local warehouse might know the hidden cheat code in the system to still trigger a delivery and send it out. And I think that's something that a lot of people are not aware of, that they say, oh, we had someone implement some kind of blocking system. It's not possible that anything is not in sync. And my experience says that whatever is physically possible to put into bits and bytes in the source system will happen ultimately at some point, especially if you're a large company. So there were actually some scenarios where we found out that, yes, they have a system that's doing their job. It's blocking. It's saying you can't do this business. And then another place, someone still manages to send out the good to circumvent those blocks. And I think that's very important to keep in mind, that even if you have one system designed to prevent and to block critical things from happening, it doesn't mean that another system in another end of the company is going, and in 100% of the cases, be respective of that. And I think there's something we need to keep in mind.